Hey everyone, it's me. Coming on strong. Happy Easter to all of my loved ones out there. So, whenever I get to this point of this year, I always have my own rendition of what took place with the resurrection. But I must always admit that the story is very unique, very endearing, and it has proliferated for the last 2,000 years. So, there's no denying that this story and how it was shaped has trickled into every facet of our existence, regardless if you're Christian, Muslim, atheist, Buddhist, Hindu. It's everywhere, right? And what I'm talking about today has to do with the main character, be it that Jesus seems like he's the main character, but it's really Judas. Because Judas is the betrayer. Judas is the catalyzer. Judas is the one that sets all the dominoes in motion. But everyone just puts him to the wayside and just says, oh, he betrayed Jesus and he didn't play a pivotal part. But in essence, he kind of did. And the reason why I want to focus on this character is because I, like most of you, I'm sure, in your spiritual journey and your undertakings and your path and your mission in life, if you are one of, the people proclaimed star-seed or chosen, black sheep of the family, you've had your share of Judases in your life. And trust me, they suck. They really suck. They're the ones that threw you under the bus. They're the ones that scapegoated you. They're the ones that made you look like a fool in front of others. They're the ones that destroyed your reputation. Name it, I've had it. I've had many. But what I can say to all the betrayers, to all the Judases in my life, I can say at this point in my life, thank you. Because had it not been for you, I would not have grown stronger. I would not have overcome you. I would not have found parts of myself that I never knew I had. I wouldn't have been comfortable in places that most people would be ashamed of. Like, there are things to be said about those that betray you. We don't really need to know the why. We don't really need to know what moved them to do it. And we don't even need to know what caused them to do the betrayal in the first place. But for myself, I can honestly say, in hindsight, not in the moment, trust me, every betrayal or betrayer I've ever had in my life has moved me forward, years, leaps and bounds forward in my spiritual growth, in my education, in my self-discovery. So sometimes I hope if you're someone who's dealing with a Judas right now, it could be from your family, from your friends, from your church. It could be those, and it's usually the ones you love the most. Okay? It's usually the ones that you put up here. It's usually the ones that you think would never do it. So I want to talk about Judas and I want to talk about betrayers because I have a different rendition of what took place in Jesus's resurrection. The key thing is that sometimes we need these betrayers to resurrect something, be it ourselves, be it our community, be it our nation, be it the world. So we can't knock these characters because they are pivotal. So I want to start off by saying that I am of the thinking that Jesus, I'm a big graillore follower, and if you don't know what that is, I do believe that Jesus did not die on the cross. I think he went on to live the life with Mary Magdalene and have his children, Sarah and Judah, or maybe more. But what I can say is that it didn't take away from who he was as a person. It didn't take away from what he endured on the cross. I just feel like there was some kind of mishap that took place. And even if you think about it this way, before I start telling the story of my rendition, you don't have to believe me. Maybe you will, maybe you won't. But let's just say, for example, if Jesus did want to just live a, let's say, seemingly normal life, they do talk about even in our modern day that sometimes people have to go through these huge planned deaths just to get a fresh start. So I'm not saying that that's what took place, but I just want to talk about some of the interruptions I saw in the story growing up as a child and a teenager and in my 20s and 30s. I just could never put those pieces together and make it make sense. So if you want to shed some light, by all means, please do. So I'm going to start this off with the story of Barabbas. Okay. So if you look at the story of Jesus in its entirety, or, the section of like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Jesus being referred to as a teacher is evident. He is brought up more than 100 times in the Bible as the teacher. And if you were to look at, let's say, Hebrew wordings or Aramaic wordings for what teacher means, it's the rabbi. So I'm brought to the story of Barabbas. This was a time right before the crucifixion where Pilate brings Barabbas in front of all the persons, the Jewish people in the square, and says to them, who should I release? Should it be Jesus or should it be Barabbas? Now, I just want to throw something out there. English is one of those languages that it was this version of English, then it was ye old English, then it was translated from Greek, from Hebrew, from Aramaic perhaps. And you have to understand there's a lot of broken telephone that happens. But let's just say Barabbas was Barabai, the rabbi. What if there was no other convict? What if it was just him being held up by himself and saying to the people, should I release the rabbi? Should I release Barabai? And to see how the people would react, to see if he was a threat. Because Pontius Pilate was, he was the governing force in that area. The Romans were trying to take over that area, much like they did with Egypt and other surrounding areas. So maybe he wanted to see if he would get all the praise and all of the tears to try to get him released, or to see the force behind his presence. So maybe ultimately it was never Barabbas, but Barabai. That was something that always stuck out to me. Maybe they were all praising that Jesus be released, not two different people. And when I point out this idea of the rabbi, the teacher, this, aside from being called the Lamb, the Messiah, the rabbi, the teacher, was a very common phrase, associated with Yeshua. Now, I must point out most apparent status of this idea of rabbi. You could only be qualified as a rabbi if you were married. In the Jewish tradition, you needed to be married in order to be proclaimed as a rabbi, because it was part of, progeny. It was part of because I would say the Jews, even in that time, just like now, the family unit was very important, and progeny and maintaining the house and maintaining the lineage was very big. So even though Jesus was seen as an Essenic Jew, the Essenes, even though they were very, very, let's say the high priests were Essenes, they were even very, very into meditation and to going off for very large sums of time to go pray and to meditate and to fast, right? But by tradition, they had to go back to their village every 3 years in order to be with their wives and procreate. So that's like a very extremist version of Judaism, of Jewish culture, but it existed, and that's the type that Jesus was. So even if, he didn't follow all of the Essenic traditions, and he probably did, in order to be a rabbi, he must have been married. So I preface this. If Jesus had to be married, who would he be married to? I postulate that he was married to Mary Magdalene. Now, I know most of you that read the Bible always put her in the ways of being the prostitute. But I will also talk about the word prostitute, because the word prostitute meant a woman of the city center in Aramaic and also in Hebrew. So a woman in the city center was not common, because women didn't go and talk about business within the city center. That's what men did. And if she was a prolific figure, which she was, because her name, Mary Magdalene, she was part of a place called Magdala, and she was the lone daughter of this estate of Magdala. So there was no sons. She was the one who had to run the estate. Therefore, she would have had to go to the city center to speak about wares, contracts, etc. concerning her estate. So I don't truly believe that Mary Magdalene was ever a prostitute. I just think it's a change of wording that was convenient for the later, post-Catholic and Roman Catholic changes. Because if you notice in the Roman Catholic, they kind of siphoned and they kind of eliminated all the prolific women, be it teachers. They made all the women either saints or nuns. There was no prolific women other than Mary, the mother of Jesus of God. And aside from that, Mary Magdalene was shrouded in a lot of shame. However, if you look at things like the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Nag Hammadi texts that were found circa, let's say, 1 Common Era, those texts were very, very pivotal. They were not brought into the modern day Bible. And there are specific texts that Mary Magdalene herself had these conversations with Yeshua. And there was also these conversations that were hosted by Judas himself and Yeshua. In these texts, there were these scrolls that were found later, but then they were never included. And then they were never brought to light, really. You really had to do your own digging to find these things out. Now, if Mary, much like the only person I would say in the more medieval times that pointed this out was Da Vinci, and we all know with, Dan Brown's story, it's there for the taking, the Last Supper, where you see that it is just a woman right beside him. And it was said many times by Simon Peter and also by Thomas and also by Judas himself, that there was some understanding that he preferred her and kissed her on the mouth. That is in the Bible, even in the King James Version. So for you to kiss a woman on the mouth meant that you did it in public. And if you did it in public, that was taboo if you were not married to them, for one thing. Okay, especially if we go with the older stories of her being a prostitute, that would have been even more taboo. Wouldn't have mattered if you were, the Messiah. It was still about it was still about the populace, and it was also about the average onlooker. So why I also say that Jesus was married was because there is a book or story in the Bible called The Wedding of Cana. I've talked about this, but I'm going to put it into perspective just so that this follow along can make sense. So in the story of the wedding of Cana, right, there are this whole wedding's going on, and people always remember that the story is that Jesus turned water into wine, and that's what seems to take shape and is most important. But there are certain things that come into play that people may not pay attention to. Is one, there's the washing of the feet, which is part of a marital practice within a Jewish marriage that takes place. Why would Mary be washing his feet at that time is important. Why would Mary, the mother, go to Jesus for this issue with the wine? You have to understand that the area that they were in was profusely rich in wine and olive oil. Like, you could literally go outside of the present place you were in and find wine very easily. So it's not like wine was scarce. So his miracle was not that, he made wine, something that's so, hard to find and scarce. No, it was robust. It was everywhere. So the point of that story that people may not understand, that I try to relate in such a practical way, Mary went to Jesus not because he was a miracle worker, not because they couldn't find wine. They literally could have gone to John or Simon's or anyone's house and found some wine. The importance of this statement is that Mary went to Jesus perhaps because he was the host of the wedding. That's what happens in modern day house parties. When people are running out of booze at a house party, who do they go to? The host. It's their responsibility, right? So I want to point that out because these are things within the Bible that were not taken out. And if you look at them in a practical way, they start to make more sense. Aside from that, though, there were these writings in those Gnostic texts that Judas, also as an apostle of Jesus, had these ongoing talks within these texts. And it was very understood, at least from those texts, that Judas and Mary, out of all the apostles, tended to understand Jesus's teachings the best, because he talked in a lot of parables. He talked with proverb. So you have to understand, even as I have read them in English, I know that there's always an underlying meaning. You have to read them twice or thrice in order to understand them. There's always an innuendo. There's always something right in front of your face that he's trying to point out. So I'm sure that it was much understood that some of the other apostles, the teachings went over their head. They couldn't understand it. They had questioned him many times about his teachings. Whereas Judas and Mary Magdalene, especially within those Gnostic texts or those texts of Nag Hammadi and or the Qumran scrolls, highlighted that they were the ones that caught on the best and understood, maybe from a spiritual understanding, better than the others. And we see this in present day because there are those of us that understand the teachings, and then there are those of us that are still confused. There's some of us that understand love and it's all its facets and capacities, and we don't need to be schooled on the idea that killing is wrong, no matter what nation or what color or what sex or whatever the case may be. It's just plain out wrong, and that's the principle, and that's the rule of thumb that we stick to. But then there are those in this world that still don't understand the concept, even though they can claim to be Christian, or they can claim to be spiritual, or they can claim to understand the order of things. So there's a difference between understanding and knowledge and practice of such knowledge. So I do want to point that out as well. So when I talk about this, I am basically saying that regardless of the fact, Judas was that of which betrayed Jesus. So we got past this Barabbas point, or the Barabai point, right? We realized that Jesus, because he was a fiduciary important character to this whole premise, he was also the son of David. That's something that's written about a lot in the Bible. And it doesn't really get shown upon because he wasn't coming from the line, let's say, of Solomon so much as he was Nathaniel, which were both the sons of Bathsheba, which was one of David's wives. But what that means is that he would have had the lineage and carried on, and we're talking maybe 13 degrees of separation from David, and Solomon. But what I mean is that Mary would have been the one carrying the house of David within her. She was the relation to this. And perhaps Joseph, but we don't know too much about Joseph, but it's definitely Mary who does. And Jesus is then in line for that kinship. And that's very understood within the time of his birth with Herod. Herod wanted to make sure that the proclaimed Messiah would be taken care of, and that's why they had to flee and fly away, not fly away, but get away to to Egypt, as it was. And it wasn't until Herod's death that Jesus even reemerged, because why would they leave if it wasn't for him being the one to take on the kingship? Now, the difference between Jesus and why it was kind of misunderstood, at least to my understanding, of why so many people could not fit him in the Messiah profile, is because most of these ushered ones, or most of these messiahs, like even David was seen as one that was sworn in by Samuel, one of the seers of God. They all were warfaring, and or I wouldn't call, they were warriors. They were ones that did and changed the course of history through war. Whereas Jesus was the first to be a messianic king who wasn't proclaiming that it should be about war. He was proclaiming that it should be about love, which was totally different than any other of the kings had ever done. And also at the same time too, he said, what is due to Rome, like give to the Romans. This was something of understanding and like kind of like compassion and compromise, which would never be seen by any other Jewish righted king in time past. So a lot of the Jewish people were thinking that this Messiah was going to show up, who was going to be like a stronghold and uplift the Israelites once again, just like every other king did, through the means of war. And Jesus was the total opposite. So he was the double-edged sword that they keep talking about over and over and over again, because he was in line to be king, yet he didn't formulate or follow the same pace and suit as the king. He did it with showing love, but he still moved everyone with his words, with his teachings. He was doing this all through that versus picking up a sword. So this put Pontius Pilate in a difficult situation, because a lot of people, not only did he have the ability to go into different houses of the Sadducees, houses of the Pharisees, houses of like any of the synagogues, he could easily walk in. And that was not something that was given to a peasant carpenter's boy. He was given that right because he had the Davidic line within him. And that's something that gets swept under the rug a lot. And that's the thing I have to say is, like, when Pontius Pilate made this move, it was political, and it was also like to contaminate the idea of the Messianic order within the Jewish and Israelite minds. Because if he could corrupt that, if he could break that down, that would help mold the next wave of the political overseeing that he was going to be walking into within the next point of his life. So we all know the rest of the story. Judas is to sabotage Jesus. He is to deny Jesus 3 times. I know what that feeling is like, because one of my Judases denied me 3 times, and I'm telling you, Jesus has this capability where he just kisses him and he goes, oh, I understand why you're doing what you're doing. And when my Judas did it to me, I was just like, okay, I guess that's just how the role works. It must be 3 times for some reason. You know what I'm saying? But this is the thing that I'm always in a flux about myself, because reading the other stories or the scrolls of Judas's writings and conversations with Jesus, there is this idea that Jesus actually asked him to betray him in order to set the ball in motion. Because what was taking place at the time that they crucified Jesus was Passover. Passover was a very celebrated time of atonement for the Jewish people. Let's say if Judea had 100,000 people, it would have doubled, maybe even tripled, with all the Jews coming from different houses, different regions of, let's say, of modern day Palestine, Syria, etc. Even some from Egypt that would come to the temple to perform and be a part of the Festival of Atonement, because it represented renewal, it represented sins being washed away, and it was a very high time for the Jewish people. So the fact that the Romans decided to crucify him on this very special and momentous occasion is quite weird, because Judas had to betray him. Jesus has the Last Supper, which was also in congruency with Passover. It was the Seder meal that he was sharing for the last time with his followers. He wasn't at the temple, but he was in his own place of choosing. And at the same time, in a sense, when Jesus went up on that cross, he is always referred to as the Lamb of God. In a sense, his sacrifice is similar and kind of parallel to what takes place on Passover, where the high priest at the temple will kill lambs and goats, and I believe they release one for Azrael to send them off. It's like kind of like that one that is not forsaken in the in that actual what is it called? That rite of atonement. I think they send one off into the wilderness, and that is representational of all the sins of the people. But in a sense, Jesus being put up to the cross on that specific time of Passover and the rite of atonement, he would have been the sacrificed lamb for all the people, in a sense. So it kind of was very parallel to the time. But what's interesting is that Judas had to go and kiss Jesus and show the Romans who he was in the Garden of Gethsemane. He was told to do this and receive 30 silver pieces. And like I said, there are those texts, the Nag Hammadi text. No, actually, I think it's at Dead Sea Scrolls that Judas had these conversations where he was told by Jesus to do this, because Jesus knew that he needed some betrayer to start the catalyzation of this resurrection. So as we know, Jesus always knew what was going to happen. You know, he could see, he had foresight. So Judas in those texts did not want to do it, but he obeyed because that was Jesus's command to him. But in the, you know, the King James version, it's seen that he's petty and greedy and he betrays him for money. And it's not to say that either way changes the story. He had to play the role of the betrayer. He had to be the one that got the catalyzing going. He's the one that made the domino effect happen. He is the pivotal changer of the story, because without him pointing him out. And that's another thing I couldn't understand too. It's like, why did these Romans need him pointed out? If he's going to the synagogues and causing havoc, how could any of the persons that knew him not just easily point him out? Or maybe they didn't want to point him out because they loved him, but there's so many people that didn't love him at that time. You know, especially the money handlers, they were not a fan of Jesus. So that story always kind of didn't sit well with me, like why they even had to have him pointed out like that in the first place, but I digress. Anyways, so once he does this, Judas, points him out, Jesus is taken, he gets whipped, he gets stoned, he has to take his own, you know, the beam of the cross to the point of where they execute him. And the thing that's really interesting is that Jesus is put up on that cross. He is then supposedly nailed within his hands and in his feet, but by all means and intensive purposes, realistically, yes, the ropes were bound around him, because when you're on a cross with the weight of gravity, like, and I'm sure you know this, for anyone who's had to carry their friend who's passed out, they weigh a lot more than when they're breathing alive and up and running. So for him to have been in the hands and the feet, I don't know if that was like artistic license, because technically it would have been in his heel and in his wrist, just to hold the weight so it wouldn't like go right through his hand. But what's interesting about that is that he also was taken down a day early because of Passover. It was understood by the Romans, and Pontius Pilate included, that should they leave him till the last day like they usually would, that would be the last day of Passover, and more persons would, you know, be around the center. They would have seen what was taking place. And he was in fear that they were going to uprise and cause havoc. So it kind of makes me feel like Pontius Pilate did this on this specific festival in order to avoid scrutiny from the Jewish people, the Israelites, because it was more so the fact that he wanted to shroud it he wanted to cover up what he was doing. But it also gives weight to the fact that Jesus did not have to suffer as long as others that were crucified. So this goes into what I was trying to say about maybe he didn't pass away like we think he did. Because also too, what is interesting is that he was given posca, which is like vinegar and water. It also was seen as like a disinfectant. The Romans used to drink this because it would disinfect any type of germs or bacteria that they would face by getting sliced and cut while at battle. So the fact that they gave this to Jesus kind of also was like a numbing agent to a degree too, to help with the pain. So that was interesting that they afforded him that. And then at the same time, like Jesus in his 30 years also went to Egypt, studied in Egypt, and was supposedly in India as well. I truly believe Jesus could have gone to levels of high meditation where he could slow his breath slow enough that he would be seemingly to the person's onlooking to not be breathing. And I don't know what's up with medical understanding at that point. I don't know why they didn't just check his pulse. But they decide instead to spear him with the spear of destiny. And there is a passage even in the King James Version that this half-blind soldier goes to spear him with the spear of destiny. And supposedly the blood gushes out. And blood in the water gushes out so profusely that it hits his eyes. And the blood miraculously clears up his sight and he can see again. But what's most notable about that situation is that, if any of you know, when you die, blood will come out of you because of gravity once again, but it will not squirt out because your heart's not pumping anymore. So he stabbed him in the side. He probably missed his heart. It probably would have gone into the intestines, because on all accounts, it wasn't within the heart. They never mentioned that. They just say the side, like where the ribs are and the intestines. So that's a little interesting too. They take him down a day early. They stab him. He still got blood pumping out of him. And he also was a miracle worker and a healer in his own right. So he probably knew methods to slow down his breathing so that he could get through the atrocious pain himself. Then another interesting characteristic that takes place is that he's allowed to be taken down early and put into a tomb, a family tomb. This goes back to the line of David thing that I was talking about, because he was put into the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. Joseph of Arimathea was a merchant. He was a really rich man. Only nobles or rich people had tombs. Okay. Yes, Joseph of Arimathea did follow Jesus and also was a fan of Jesus, but that doesn't mean why he would put him in his own family tomb, unless he was family. And it is understood that perhaps Joseph of Arimathea was the uncle of Mary, Mother Mary. So that would mean that would be Jesus's like great uncle in that instance. So Jesus, like Joseph of Arimathea being of noble blood as well, kind of highlights that there's a lot of masquerading as to who Jesus really was. Was he a prince that renounced all his princedom just to be a regular human, which made him even more cool and sick and powerful, doing what he did, sitting on the mount, not needing a dollar from anyone, and trying to overturn all the money handlers and saying that God was not found in these houses, he was only found within, and that money doesn't get you into the kingdom of heaven, only that of which is within your heart. He was even the one who walked the walk a lot more, provided that he did come from this lineage. And that is not really, pointed at a lot. So he gets to go into this tomb, his family tomb. And he's met with Mary, his mother, Mary Magdalene again, and his cousin. Why is Mary Magdalene there? Aside from the fact that she's an apostle, or aside from the fact that she's his wife? Because none of the other apostles went there to go help and aid. It was just her and the main women in his life. So that's another reason why I think she was also his wife. But here's the thing. They were, wrapping him, taking care of him within those days. And again, he's a miraculous healer. I'm pretty sure he could have healed parts of himself if he wanted to. He's the Son of God. Okay? So with all this being said, did Jesus fully die on that cross? I'm not totally sure. I always felt like he needed to play out this story. He needed to be put on the cross. He needed to be sacrificed in a way that people would know that there's life after death. And that there's more to life than just the 3D attainments, the egoistic attainments, that God the Father, God the Mother is always with us, within us, and we can do anything with that God spark within us. And we don't need all the riches, and we don't need all the things that we find in this life that we feel make us great. And it also shaped the rest of the history just because of what he offered himself up to do. Because no one in history has ever offered themselves so willingly for our sins. And that's what made him great. And that's what made him amazing, regardless if he died or didn't. And like I said, I'm a fan of the Grail. So I do feel like he did make it out. He probably went on. And maybe he made it to France. Maybe he made it to Scotland, as those of Glastonbury always comment on. In the Arthurian legends. Arthurian legends. That's what do they call that? That's a slip of the tongue. That's a Freudian slip. Anywho, I do believe that he had children, but it doesn't take away from the fact that he resurrected a different view of life within all of us by doing what he did. And he has shaped the rest of the world profusely ever since. But I, as someone who is a big believer in the divine feminine and recapturing the divine feminine, the Roman Catholics started devising and figuring out ways in which to make Jesus' story into a religion. Because even after, 100 AD, the Romans were still making fun of Jesus. They were still putting up profane graffiti of him. They didn't believe in him. They still were pagan in their own right. And at the same time, here was this God, the God of the Jews, that had this major figure that was being spread like wildfire all through Asia, Africa, the Middle East, even within Europe. And as the Roman Catholics devised this new religion, which was really loosely based off of stories that they collected. And you have to remember too, that a lot of the stories of Jesus's life that may have been captured within Egypt were probably destroyed in the Library of Alexandria without, or not even just that. There's so many things that got destroyed along the way. The one thing that is understandable is that as the years rolled on, in France, most of the, you have to understand, first came the Roman Catholic Church. They created it. They started playing around with it. Then we start moving into the times of the early Crusades, 1200s, 1300s. There are Knights Templars that are going in to different parts of Portugal, Spain, and our Iberia and France. And they're erecting churches devoted to Mary Magdalene, because deep down inside, you have to understand, these knights were the ones pillaging. They were the ones taking all the art and all the books. And if they read those books, they probably knew what the real story was. Why would they create the churches? Why would they give up homage to Mary Magdalene and Jesus's line continuing? And then those within the papacy that wanted to ensure that Jesus's line was killed, they had the Council of Nicaea take out any rendition of Jesus ever being married, ever having children, ever being normal, a normal human. That would be wrong. He couldn't be normal and God at the same time. It didn't work for their story. And at the same time, it couldn't be that Mary Magdalene was one of his apostles. It couldn't be that she went on to teach his ways. It couldn't be that they both went on to teach their ways and that they had children and they lived normal lives. But the Templars of that age were erecting huge churches to Mary Magdalene. And funny enough, the papacy started going from town to town to town in France. Anywhere that had children or persons within that last name, Magdalena or Magdala, or had some tie to the supposed bloodline of Jesus. And they would just burn away those towns. And it wasn't unfamiliar that even though those lineages were given a heads up, because there were whispers all around that the papacy was going to send these knights or send these persons to destroy all these towns and these churches, or any remnants of the actual lineage, but it still continued, because you can't kill the truth. So I'll leave you with this. We live in a world where we are even facing one big Judas staring at us in the face, and we all know who this person is. And he's betrayed us, the nations, himself, mankind. But in some ways, he needs to exist so that bigger sacrifices can be found and made. I don't understand why the Judas energy, or let's say the betrayal energy, has to exist in life, but it does. And I can only speak for myself as someone who believes in hope and life everlasting, that every single one of my Judases, everyone who came to betray me, was there for a purpose. They catalyzed me, and I hope you realize this too. They're not there to take you down. They're there to make you stronger. They're there to make you wiser. They're there to show you what you're really made of. It's like, in a sense, they want to spar with you. They want to go toe-to-toe, spiritually, mentally, emotionally, because they're designed that way. You'll never know your true grit until you're faced with a Judas or a betrayer. So in some ways, it doesn't matter if Judas was put up by Jesus to do it, or if he was just greedy and he ended up committing suicide due to his greed and his self-righteous fall away. But the end of the story ends up is that resurrection is possible for all of us. And we don't maybe just resurrect once in our lives. It can be multiple times. Every time we come from those ashes into the phoenixes that we are. Rebirth is renewal. It is spring every year. So it doesn't mean that anything truly dies. There is this rebirth continuously shown to us in nature. So I just want to say this. I love you guys lots, but don't hate the player, hate the game. You know what I'm saying? Sometimes you just have to understand and roll with the punches and know that no matter how dark it looks, no matter how bad they make you look, how bad they make you fall, it's teaching you how to get back up again. And that will be the surprise. No one will expect you to get back up. No one will expect Jesus to walk out of that tomb, even though he said he would. But the point is that if you have and hold that conviction in your heart, nothing can stop you. Bye for now.